Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our just general joy of being alive. And of course, we always talk about sustainable design and beauty as well. Today, I want to introduce you to Molly Polehna, who's an interior designer with Little Diversified. Molly, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. We were just chatting about this before we started recording. This is our 5th episode with guests from Little Diversified. The other 4 were awesome, and this is going to be awesome too, Molly. You are an interior designer. Tell us what attracted you to that world, and then tell us about the path that led you to be working with Little.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and interior design was never at my forefront. I knew I wanted to do something really creative and with my hands. I never wanted to sit in front of a computer for the rest of my life. A little ironic. I am working on my computer most days, but I wanted that versatility and that creative kind of outlet. And I always had this love for sustainable design as well and sustainable artwork. And so my early artwork was often found objects that I was putting together and telling stories. And when I started to understand the built environment, it was actually through theme park design. When I realized you could design theme parks, I was like, whoa, we can transport people to different worlds and immerse them in these environments that are beyond what we have in real life. And I fell in love with the idea of designing concepts for theme parks. Cut to college years, and I'm in school, I'm working on a production design pathway, and I had a professor come to me and he was like, I think you might want to reevaluate a little bit, and architecture and interior design can serve a lot of these purposes that might be better suited. And so I switched my major and I started taking interior design classes, and I fell in love with the process, the iteration, the collaboration. I'm a sketcher at heart, so I was always going through trace paper and just that studio culture. And that's what kind of transported me to interior design in built environments a little more grounded. And then I realized my love for sustainability kind of got married into that a little more effectively than with an industry that ultimately can be a little additive in some ways. So I kind of fell into it that way. And then Little came along. Also, I went to Savannah College of Art and Design in Georgia, and they do this really great trip. They take students to Orlando and they tour them around to a bunch of themed entertainment firms. I still had that interest, so I was on that group, and we ended up at Little. And, I didn't really know Little did themed entertainment work, but they do some work with the parks and other kind of features like zoos and things of that nature and museums. And I met this great guy named Pete Hall and Philip Donovan, who was previously on this podcast, and they opened up the world of sustainable design and the values that Little has. And it just was a perfect fit. They were talking about daylighting and screening. And I was in parametric design classes at the time. And I was like, this is it. Like, this is where I belong. My first day as an intern, I was sketching out ergonomic desks for a media center in a school. And all the pieces fell together. They couldn't get rid of me if they tried. I'm here for the long haul. So Little became my escape of design that was truly authentic.
That is wonderful. Are you doing any work with theme design these days?
Not as much. I have a couple smaller, more hospitality-driven projects, and I am working on kind of uplifting a regenerative hospitality. And we could talk for days about this. I think it's a really unique kind of perspective of getting into, again, an industry that ultimately, to run hospitality, it just takes a lot of resources through the way they, operate a space. And so when we look at the design of it, I think we can really start to dial some things back and help lead a behavioral change. That being said, I've not done too many hospitality or themed specific projects, and I'm perfectly okay with that because I'm able to tell stories in different ways. And again, in some ways more authentic, because we're not necessarily transporting someone to a new world, but into a world that is theirs already, and just bringing that to life in space for other occupants to see.
I love that. All right. You talked about sustainable design. We also talk a lot about occupant health on the show. So let's go right at mashing them all together. Give me some examples of how interior design can affect well-being, occupant comfort, either positively or negatively.
Yeah, again, we could probably have a whole episode just about this, and I'll try to make this a little more broad, but interior design touches every surface and the space in a building. And that includes the space plan and arrival moment, arrival to departure. We are in there. And so when you start to understand occupant well-being and health, it's not just about the materials that are in a space, whether that's the carpet and paint that we're using, but it's about how we can program spaces in that promote a better wellness aspect and how we can function in a space and make that more effective for the user. I really feel like interior design is cyclical. One thing leads to the next. Indoor air quality is a really big impact, and that comes from what materials we're specifying and how they get installed. And again, that's like one piece of the puzzle, but it starts to connect into the rest of it. And then we have to work with our mechanical engineers to make sure we have a great filtering system and vice versa. All these things, again, start to relate into each other. And when a space doesn't make you feel great, like you walk in and you're just like, ooh, whether it's the lighting levels and it's too dim, or if it's a maze of a space to navigate and there's just not that intuitive understanding of how a space functions, you feel it. And we are there to mitigate that and to help really inform a user journey that is efficient and effective and is comfortable. And again, there's so many little facets we can get into, but I'll say this, sick building syndrome is a real thing, and we can really alleviate some of those issues early on in the design process. And again, with material selections, of course, and indoor furniture selections as well. Everything kind of leads into that. I always go back to indoor air quality, but it's the air we breathe. So we have to be mindful of it.
You mentioned, those moments where you walk into a building and it's just kind of, right? It's either dull or it evokes some sort of negative emotion that just says, I don't want to be here. Can you give me some examples of the elements that are there that can create those emotions and how you make those go away so that it becomes a space that I'm thinking retrofits right now, but even, initial design when you're just at the form stage, how do you make sure that the entrance point and the journey and the occupation, an experience that make you want to come back to that building?
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors.
What are the ones that jump to your head right away?
I think spatially, going into a really tight kind of corridor or something that is condensed, and that's never inviting. So having that open space, I think daylight, access to light is always going to be a big one. I think about this in hospitals a lot. I've been in some crazy old hospitals that are just, again, not inviting. Like you come in and it's just dark and there's just, again, quite condensed. So there's not this openness. I'll always get into plants as well. I think when you start to see natural elements, this connection to the outdoors, again, there's a visual impact about how we're, again, grounded in something we're familiar with. And then wayfinding's another big one. If you go into a space and you can't understand where to go next, again, there's something missing, and we can alleviate that with signage or, again, flooring transitions, so many different ways. But those are the big ones that stick out to me as a designer. But light is always a big one. It's hard to miss that, especially natural light.
I imagine those long, dark corridors with the glare-filled, window right at the very end of the corridor that does nothing to illuminate the corridor, but just kind of puts everybody into like a silhouette. We've all been in those buildings, and it sort of says, get out. Yeah. Let's talk about materials for just a minute. You mentioned materials a couple of times, but let's go into it. I mean, we select materials for beauty, aesthetics, sometimes, often there's other purposes, but, sometimes the material that seems to be optimal might be at odds with health or sustainability goals. Can you share an example or two where you've run into this and how you've resolved it?
Yeah, to your point, there's a lot of different things we filter through when selecting materials, and beauty and aesthetics tend to be up towards the top, no matter what. It has to align with our design intent. And I'll give this as a quick example. I think of tile as not being the most sustainably made material, but it has a really great trade-off in the resiliency during its lifespan in a space, bathrooms being one.
Yep.
I worked early on in public schools, and what they've had to do with graffiti and on walls that cannot be as easily cleaned has been a big impact. So now they're spending a lot more material cost going back and fixing some areas like that. And so sometimes it's not necessarily about finding a better alternative, it's reducing the amount of material we allow to be in a space. That being said, the industry has changed quite a bit, even from when I entered, 5 years ago. And there are so many good alternatives out there. And there's a really big partnership with our reps and our specialists in materials. And we need to lean on them for what they can bring to the table. Like, I say this because there's no way we can understand every single aspect of a material. I'm sure seasoned designers definitely know a lot more than someone first getting into it, but our reps, they know everything. They're the experts. And so when we can leverage their understanding of how materials are sustained and maintained throughout a process, sometimes the trade-offs aren't as bad as we initially expect them to be. Or they can help lead us to a better alternative that is out there. I think VCT is another big one that I commonly see being used still. It's vinyl composite tile, for those that don't know. And there are a lot of other materials out there like LVT, which still a vinyl. Now there's bio-based resilient flooring and rubber flooring that, again, much healthier in the makeup of the material and in the maintenance. We're not going back in and waxing floors. But change is a hard thing to do. And so leaning on our reps, sometimes we get mock-ups done and a client can really see like, hey, this is a better solution that not only is healthier for the environment, but also the occupants and is reducing maintenance costs. So we need to be cognitive of the alternatives that are out there. And I think that helps in our selection process too. And, maybe it's not about recommending the most aesthetic thing when we can replicate that with better alternatives that exist, or again, reducing the amount of something that goes into a space. So we're not adding a lot of harmful chemicals or toxins that potentially could be off-gassed in a space.
Imagine a building where natural light flows freely, solar heat gain is under control, and comfort is unmatched. With Solera translucent glazings, you can create spaces that work better, feel better, and deliver lasting value. Learn how at advancedglazings.com.
Right. Molly, this is going to end up being, episode like 130 or something like that. And you are the first guest to talk about how important it is to work with your reps. I'm so glad that somebody finally said it. I don't know why I didn't prompt it earlier, but what a brilliant insight. And thank you so much for that. That is so helpful. Let's talk about noise a little bit. I bring a lot of leading building scientists on the show. Stefano Schivone from Berkeley, he was on, and he showed me a list of some of the survey work that's been done and how it's been compiled. And they talk about complaints from building occupants. What are the things that make the space the least comfortable, the least inviting? Unwanted noise is always near the top. It's always top 5 and usually top 3. So is dealing with sound management, is that part of your role? And if so, can you tell us about the process for designing for noise and sound management?
Yeah, sound management is always, again, going to be part of our role and something we take into account when designing spaces. And I'm always going to go back to this, but space planning is the best passive way to mitigate some of these issues, again, early on in the process. So locating private spaces in different areas than a public space, if there's a way we can physically separate spaces, whether that's a vestibule or some form of sound buffer spatially, that is going to be the first line of defense on any sound mitigation. That being said, there's not always space for that, especially in renovations. We are working within parameters that we often cannot change or have limited availability to change. And so, we have to understand STC, which is sound transmission coefficient, NRC, noise reduction coefficient, and there's IIC, which is insulated impact coefficient. So we have these kind of 3 coefficients that we understand, and when we're making, again, material selections, whether that's for the floor, ceiling, or walls, we can start to integrate different ratings depending on the space and what the requirements are per the client's requests, or just because we know programmatically the space is going to be a lot noisier than a conference room or a private office because X, Y, and Z is happening in that program. So definitely a big part. The other thing I'll mention too is technology's come a really long way. And now there's like sound masking systems that we use. And again, this is back to that leveraging our partners, whether that's an AV tech or a furniture vendors, they tend to have sound masking systems as part of their scope. And they kind of pump in like a white noise throughout an open office. And I think that's the most applicable application. I saw a demo of this a couple weeks ago, or it's been a couple months, I guess now, but it's crazy how noticeable it is when they turn off that system and you can hear verbatim what someone's saying across the room versus when you start to hear this little bit of white noise, it starts to mask, per the name of the system, mask what people are saying. So it seems like an additive item, but it actually really disperses the noise throughout and it creates if there's concerns of confidentiality, this buffer that, again, is helping with sound transmission and reflection between spaces. And the last thing I'll add is we leverage acquisitions when needed, event spaces, theater spaces, even music suites in schools. They have very specialized requirements. And again, we can't specialize in everything or be experts in everything. So when they're running calculations, we can, we take that to heart and we will iterate on our design to make it better effective. We want the spaces to function as they're designed to. So backing it up with facts and calculations is always a big must. And so spaces like that, where acoustics play a massive role, we will often have consultants on our team.
I have to ask you about the white noise. Is the white noise intrusive in any way, Molly?
We have it in our office in Orlando. And when I was first told about it, I didn't even realize we had it. If you sit directly under the speaker, sometimes you can pick up on it, but you really have to key your ear into it. And if you're not focused on it, you really don't notice it. And that's kind of goes back to that demo and why demos are so important. Like when we had our client come in, you didn't know it was on until they turned it off. And it was night and day. So it's something that needs to be programmed properly. And, of course, it can't be super loud because that will start to really play into the impact of that noise. But it's quite quiet and quite subdued. And it's just kind of there in the background.
That's really cool. I've never really heard that before, but it makes a lot of sense. And man, that's a really neat idea and a really good solution. Let's talk natural light. You mentioned natural light earlier, the importance of natural light. I know Little Diversified are big fans of daylighting. As an interior designer, like what role do you play in supporting the efforts to bring in more natural light and to manage that light so that it's not full of glare and you don't end up with blinds covering all that beautiful natural light? And you also, you're in the South, you have to avoid the thermal discomfort that comes from having lots of glazed area as well. How do you, as an interior designer, help to optimize the availability and the softness and proper implementation of natural light?
Yeah, who doesn't love natural light? It is such a hot commodity and such a great amenity. And when we, I'll go back to space planning as being our first pass of how we can bring light into a space. And I'm going to look at more of a workplace environment just for the sake of this conversation. But when we program space out and, traditional workplace design often had the perimeters filled with private offices. That's what we see traditionally. But that doesn't really allow light to filter into a space and become a shared kind of amenity. And so we've seen trends, and this is not isolated to Little, but we flip that on its head and we let the private offices become more internal and the open workspaces really share that natural light. Not only is it now shared among all users, but the light penetrates much deeper into the space and reaches different areas that it might not have originally with just walls being there. Now, heat gain and everything also plays a role. And even if we don't have the ability to change the building orientation, understanding how a building's oriented is always going to be key as we make decisions about how a space is set up. Lead in Well, I think Well especially has some really great standards about how to orient space to mitigate glare. A good rule of thumb is to have your workstations oriented 90 degrees perpendicular to a window to help reduce that. But often we see roller shades or blinds and stuff go up on the walls or on the windows. And so when we start to see that, a little disheartening, right? But if there's ways that we can start to say, well, we can integrate daylight sensors so it'll automatically shift. And then, the user's not having them down 90% of the time. It automatically goes up throughout the day. And I think that's a really great solution when there is a want for natural light and there is a desire for it, but we know occupants struggle sometimes with the operation of it. And our office is probably a good example of that too. Someone might pull a shade because their glare is just hitting just right at a certain time of day, and then that blind doesn't go back up. So we do have to be mindful of that and how we can mitigate some of that user experience and make it easier for the user to enjoy natural light, while also, again, understandably, especially in the South, that light is harsh and glare is real, especially in workplace design or conference rooms or whatever the case is. We need to be mindful of it. I'll also go back to space planning for a quick second, that when we have very specific programs, sometimes those spaces don't require natural light, and that's okay. And again, leaving more of a shared amenity to really emphasize that natural light, or areas where we have a lot of access, is a priority. And I think that can be a really great conversation about, let that be an amenity for all users in a space, and let that be accessible, not just to one person or to one unique program piece, but to everyone.
That's highly democratizing. I love that. It's funny, the sponsor of the show, Advanced Glazings, is doing a bunch of work with Little right now. We've got several projects where we're using light diffusion to get some glare-free light into a space. Oh, that's really cool. Some very insightful things there too, Molly. Let's change gears a little bit. I want to talk about, I guess this is an aesthetic question. The process, it's a question that's always been a mystery for me, so I'm really looking forward to this. Tell me about the process of aligning the interior design with the facade to ensure there's congruency, or like it just doesn't matter if there's congruency.
I always think it matters. I think when we can have a holistic design approach, like that is where, it's a successful design. And it does depend. Like, again, if we're working a renovation, it's going to be so much different than working a new building. And, I'm really fortunate. I work a lot of new buildings. I work often with architects, and there's a big open dialogue there. But when we are working within set parameters, we do need to be mindful of the facade. And if we don't have the opportunity to punch new openings or to change certain things, we need to be cognitive about how our design relates to that. I've worked in some really funky buildings, maybe some outdated buildings that aren't quite something we want to highlight. So sometimes it's a conversation about how do we minimize some of the form that the building has and maybe distract from it in certain ways if it's just not quite successful in how we're reprogramming the space, but still being very cautious about, and I'll go back to windows quite a bit, but if we're aligning to a mullion grid, like, of course, we want to maximize as much light as possible. I don't want to be furring out over windows if I can help it. Like, let's celebrate what's there, what's existing as much as we can, because who wants to add more material? It's just more cost. And from a sustainability standpoint, like, I don't want to add unless I absolutely have to.
More embodied carbon.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big conversation when we're renovating. And when we're ground up, oh my gosh, what a dream. I think interiors often can inform the exterior facade of a building. And I think we need to kind of reevaluate how we work a process. And I think Little does a really good job of this. Like I said, for a while, I was sitting in a group of architects. I wasn't even sitting next to an interior designer, and I've since moved. Now I sit next to a civil engineer, which is even better. So it's a dialogue. It's an open conversation. It's about, if we're going to have millwork in a room and they have floor to ceiling glass on the wall that I need millwork on, like, again, what's the point of that material? It's not serving a function anymore. So we definitely want to be aligned. We definitely want to be congruent with them. And we want to be, again, that end goal, that success story is when we're mashed up in a really good way and we perform the dance to the best of our ability and we're successful. And I say this jokingly, but my first conversation, especially on ground up buildings, is I need all the windowsills to be at least 3'3", depending on the coursing and the building material. But when furniture gets pushed under a windowsill, like, I want to make sure it clears that and is ADA accessible. So again, all these kind of little rules that we picked up along the way can start to inform that exterior facade.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
I love that. Yeah, wonderful answer. So let's talk about biophilic design. All right. Hot topic, obviously, and I'm excited to hear your take on it. So there's a difference between like trends and then like a really meaningful application. How do you incorporate biophilic design in a way, that it supports measurable well-being outcomes as well as the aesthetics?
This is my favorite question. I love this question. I think biophilia is such a great tool. It's definitely a hot topic and a trend that, we're not moving away from, which is great. I feel like when I was in school, it was everyone's design concept was biophilia, was organic and natural elements. And to your point, there are ways to incorporate it from an aesthetic standpoint that maybe are not as impactful as they could be. So I think we need to back up and really understand what biophilia is. It's the love for life, it's the love for nature, incorporating nature, and really like understanding that we as humans crave that. But there's levels to it. I think on a surface level, it's bringing plants and nature into a space. Then we get into forms and shapes and organic kind of material that simulate nature. And then systematically, biomimicry is such a big tool. And I think that's where the biggest impacts can come from, even if a user is not as conscious of it. So I'll give an example because I think we've done it quite successfully in a couple spaces. And the first one, this is a micro rethink. So Little does these little design charrettes, and we reinvest into our firm R&D. But we did a mass timber tower in the heart of downtown, just conceptual design. But we had started to organize the design based on this bromeliad plant, which if you look up an image of it, you can see it kind of has these like petals that stack on top of each other. And the petals or leaves, they capture the rainwater and they store it. And so, this isn't quite interior design, but when we looked at the balconies for the hotel rooms on the top levels, the profile of it kind of had that same shape, and it captured rainwater, stored it, and then it was used on the interior of the building. Of course, all conceptual, it would have been filtered and everything else. But when we start to dive into these natural systems that are truly successful because nature has set them up to be, and we start to mimic that into a space or design, like that is like the bread and butter. Like that's where you're getting your impact. I'll give one more example that's more interior focused. I worked on a school down in Miami-Dade, South Florida. And when we first started looking at the design concepts, we dove into the mangrove system. And mangroves are really unique plants. They're really cool trees. Their root systems are really cool to see if you're ever down in South Florida or somewhere that has that mangrove system and you're able to go kayaking, like highly recommend. Visually, very aesthetically pleasing. But when you take a section through a mangrove and you start to see those root systems holding in the sand, it's such a good form of resiliency. And South Florida, especially being hit by hurricanes time and time again, those systems really hold it together. And then when we start to stretch it open even more, like within those root systems that are stretched underwater, that's where fish hold their nest and they raise their little guppies, and it becomes a nurturing environment. And then, the treetops, similar, birds have their nest. It's just this really great ecosystem of different plants and animals. And so when we started to look at the building design and the interior, not only were we selecting materials that simulated roots and canopy floors and underwater floors, but we started to look at the first floor being that nurturing environment, immersive, underwater, very calm, a little bit quieter. That's where the kindergarten through third grade had lived. And then on the second floor, it was the greens and it was the treetops and it was this, you're able to soar. And we started to simulate those elements with the treetop canopy visuals and kind of painted out green ceilings in certain spaces. And so there's ways like that, again, subconsciously, we might not be able to take a visual cue that says like, well, I'm underwater in a nurturing environment, but subconsciously we feel these elements that truly impact how we operate in that space and the behaviors in that space. So I think there's some really great ways to integrate biophilia in that sense. And that's, probably closer to biomimicry. But when we bring plants and stuff into a space, and I say that I have a plant directly behind me, although it's artificial, I can't keep plants alive. We need to be also cognitive of that. I think that's where sometimes the trends cannot be as successful if we're bringing planters into spaces that either can't sustain them, whether they don't have great access to natural light, or, the occupants don't have that green thumb. Like, is it serving its purpose as much as it could be? Maybe it's better suited to have a mural of plants or a wall covering that simulates wood. We need to be cognitive of the end users and, again, operations of that space.
Oh, that was a wonderful answer. I want to come back to mass timber. You mentioned a mass timber tower, and this is a question I've sort of wondered for a while, and I'm so glad I have an interior designer. Does the presence of mass timber or the use of mass timber expand your palette, or does it diminish your palette, or is it neutral?
I think it diminishes your palette in the best way possible. So I'm really fortunate. I've worked on 2 mass timber buildings in Florida, and less is more. I think we need to go back to that. And mass timber, like, if we're going to bring that building system into a space, we should be celebrating it. There's certain elements maybe not quite right for every client. It exposes all the building systems, so we need to be cognitive of that. And sometimes you don't want to see a big HVAC system sitting,
Right.
mounted. So we need to be really coordinated. But I think it limits what you put in there in, again, the best way possible. Who wouldn't want to see wood walls and a wood deck? Like, that's great. It's brilliant.
There's evidence that we are more productive and potentially healthier just by being able to look at wood. Like
Oh my
just
God. Yeah.
seeing wood in the workplace, it has been demonstrated through study to improve productivity, which I find thoroughly amazing. But maybe it's not that amazing if you think about, we've spent most of human existence out in the forest, right? It's relatively recent that we've spent so much time inside. So that's wonderful. I want to talk a little bit about the process. You've spoken about this all. It's kind of been sprinkled through the entire conversation. But I want to talk, if you can give me any kind of insights into the process of how the interior designer works with the architects and the engineers and the energy consultants in order to be part of tying the whole thing together so that we don't get, stovepipe in our design methodologies.
Yeah, I know I mentioned this already, but I work with architects almost every day, and I can't imagine my job without that. I think what's so special about this industry is the collaboration and, interior design to architect to engineer to energy model consultants. I'm really fortunate that we have all those roles at Little, and sometimes we're working on one big integrated team, and it doesn't really feel like there's specific roles. It feels like we're all going towards the same goal. We want the building to be successful and, again, functional. I will always go back to that. I think that's what we want a building to function as. And so sometimes it's conversations of like, hey, I need to move this wall, or what is the structure here so we can effectively or more efficiently program out the space? Can we shift something 6 inches left or right? It's constantly a back and forth. I love it. I think that's the best part of this industry. My closest friends tend to be engineers because I think I become a better designer if I know how spaces go together better. And we can't limit ourselves either. I don't think boxing ourselves in and siloing ourselves benefits anyone. Everyone has a seat at the table, and sometimes the best solutions come from someone that doesn't have that role. I've worked on master plan studies and design charrettes, and I've worked through facade studies with Philip before. And I think like that's what makes it so exciting, is that we can stretch kind of our design process and stretch our design thinking when we're overlapping and we're not saying, well, this is where the exterior stops and, I take over. You're not successful when you work like that. And similarly with engineers, I think, like I said, my closest friends tend to be engineers, and I've had electrical engineers come in and say, well, it might work better this way. And they were completely right. And the client loved that idea. And that's the path we went down. So I don't know if there's a specific process that I follow. I think it's just being open-minded and not closing a door before it even gets opened. So having that dialogue open all the time, and especially with energy models and consultants, again, we have some of that in-house at Little. So if we're running carbon analysis or daylighting analysis and coming back and saying, hey, I think you need to shift that program. Okay, like let's make it
Right.
work. We have to be open to that.
Right on. Okay, Molly, we're at the point in the show where I ask my $1,000,000 question. So there's a question that I ask every single guest, and I ask them to answer it from whatever perspective they like. So here you go. What makes a great building?
It's a tough question. I would have answered this so differently 5 years ago. But to me, a great building is one that authentically serves the purpose that it was built to have. It serves the occupancies in the most honest way it can, and it truly uplifts the community that it's part of. I think when we start to abstract what buildings are from the moment that you arrive to a building to the moment you leave, that user experience is so vital, and it just needs to be authentic. I don't have a better word for it, but it should evolve of what the building's purpose is and what that community is. And I always go back to the sense of place, but when we start to embody where our buildings live, like, that's a really great building, that's a successful building. And I could love putting wood paneling all around, but if that's not what serves the function, then it's not successful at that point. So it needs to be there for the occupants and the people it's serving.
I love that. You know what I was thinking about when you were talking about authenticity? I was imagining Las Vegas, the lunacy of Las Vegas with all the lights and the noise and the sparkly things and the fake things that are there. But for Vegas, that's authentic.
Yeah,
Right? That's what
exactly.
Vegas is. It's just way over the top and, everybody knows it's fake, but everybody's having a ball with it. So it's great. It's wonderful. Yeah, I loved your answer. And, authentic, it is such a perfect word. Before we go, do you have any news that you'd like to share? Anything cool that's happening with Molly or with Little Diversified?
Yeah, there's a couple quick projects I'd love to share. One of them is the Nature Center at the Popka Birding Park. It's put on by the Orange Audubon Society, and it's gone through permitting, and we're getting excited, hopefully going into construction soon. But it's a small nature center. It's an adaptive reuse. It was a truck stop from the 1960s, and it's on this really brilliant site, that Lake Apopka, where they've reclaimed a lot of the lake from really harmful industrial issues that had gone on long before they turned it into a natural birding park. And they just have a really great mission. So I just want to give them a quick plug. They're currently fundraising for the operations of the project. And so, again, really great group. And the other one is Four Roots Farm Campus. They're also located in the heart of Florida. It's an urban farm, and we worked on phase 1 of the project, and we're now on phase 2. And they, again, have a really great mission about educating those on the power of food, and not only about where it comes from, but how to grow it and how to source it. They do a lot more, and they uplift their community. I really suggest you check them out further. We have information on our website, and of course, Four Roots, I think it's fourroots.org, is a really great resource. And again, just these really great projects that are not only benefiting themselves, but the greater community. And I think that's what's really special about some of the work we do at Little. And just, again, I implore you to check them out. Really cool.
Right on. Molly, thank you so much. This has been an absolute joy. You put on a masterclass today. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been an honor to be here.
You take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.